Alright, in this video we're going to walk through the installation procedure for the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator kit for the new Suzuki GSX-S750. Now before we get into the installation process for the Fender Eliminator kit, I'd like to go over some of the details of the GSX-S750 kit from Vagabond Motorsports. Now, this is made in the USA from a single piece of 1/8 inch thick aluminum, CNC laser cut, CNC bent, coated in UV resistant satin black powder coat. So it should be very durable and it should match the OEM kind of textures and colors really well. Keeping with that theme, our Fender Eliminators are set up to reuse the OEM lights where possible, and so the OEM license plate light is going to mount to this flange, and this their grommets, Suzuki's grommet's going to plug right in, and then on the left and right flanges we're going to install the OEM Suzuki turn signals. Now this larger forward hole will also accept really any aftermarket turn signal that uses that 10mm threaded stud approach. And so for the same kit you can also switch your turn signals either right away or later date to whatever ones you prefer. Now, other things about the Vagabond Motorsports kit is we always include a rubber grommet on the top plate to reduce wire chafing into the subframe, and rubber bumpers on the license plate flange so that there's no license plate buzzing with kind of motor revs. We're going to include a full hardware kit that's going to include 4 machined aluminum spacers and a complete set of stainless steel hardware, so it'll be very corrosion resistant. Nothing on this kit can rust, so you can get it wet, you can ride it a full season, and nothing here is going to corrode. Now, as for tools you're going to need for this install, you're going to need a 4 and a 5mm Allen key. We're going to use T handles. There's actually L keys in your toolkit with the bike if you need them. 8mm box end wrench, set of flush cutters or dikes or something to cut a zip tie, and a 10mm socket with an extension so you can take that rear fender off, the factory rear fender off. Now, we're going to be using a power driver with a couple of bits to speed up this install, and if you have those and are comfortable using them, go ahead and do that. Now, the first step in installing any Fender Eliminator is going to be to remove the OEM factory rear fender on the S650. You're going to start by removing the rider seat with the key. You're going to grab a 5mm Allen wrench, and you're going to take off the side plastic panels on the left and right side of the bike. Now, like a lot of newer bikes, you can't just pop the rider seat off really easily. You're going to have to actually pull this whole black plastic panel off. Once you get that 5mm bolt out, set it aside, and you're going to pull this entire plastic piece towards you. And it's going to, the only piece that it's stuck into, there's a little tooth back here under this part of the seat. So kind of work from the front. There's 3 plastic plugs you're going to have to pull loose. Don't be scared about breaking too much stuff. Once you pop it loose from the third one, this whole piece is going to slide out. So you can see there's 3 teeth or little plugs that go into 3 rubber grommets, and you're actually going to have to pull those free to get that panel off. Now you're going to have to do exactly the same thing on the left side of the bike, same exact thing as the right, where you're going to remove the one visible bolt with a 5mm Allen key and pull the, once you take the whole bolt out, remove the bolt. There's going to be 3 plugs. Start at the front. You're going to have to get it all the way out, and then there's always going to be one on this last section that kind of feels like it wants to rip the back side of the tail section off, so you can use your thumb and kind of push against that and pop it out. You can tell there's just one tooth that you don't want to just yank it out. It's kind of going to go forward like that. Now once you've got both plastics out, you can remove the seat, and that is same 5mm on both, again, left and right sides of the bike. So while you're here, let's pull these guys out. And all this hardware you're going to reuse, so don't lose it. Organize it, set it aside. Once you're done with that, the seat is going to lift up from the front, and you're going to kind of rock it upwards and take it off, set it aside. So to install the Fender Eliminator and remove the factory fender for that matter, you don't actually need to remove these 2 side panels, and so all you really need to do is free up, the connection is down here, kind of on the right side in front of the seat. So to get access to those connectors, you're going to want to, it's probably easiest to just remove this. There's 2 reusable zip ties. One's at the last part of the frame, subframe spar. That one you can remove. There's another one that's mounted to
the little cross brace for the passenger seat, and you can put your finger in there and loosen that whole assembly. You don't need to take that one out, just because working back there is going to be a little tricky. You need to make enough space that you can kind of tug on this part of the harness. And we'll move forward by the battery section, where you can actually see what connections we have to remove. Now, the 3 connectors that we need to remove are all kind of hiding right under here. 2 are going to be really easy to kind of fish hook. They're one for, actually I think the license plate light, the white connector, is actually buried back a little bit. But the way these connectors release is really easy. They all have kind of a little diving board on them. You just lift that up, they pull apart. So I recommend getting those 2 out of the way. You'll see those pull right up. Those are your 2 turn signals. Now you'll see there's one more glossy jacketed cable coming down. There actually is a white connector, and you're gonna have to kind of peek underneath to see it, but it opens up exactly like all the other ones, so that if you can get a finger under it, you can just lift that tab, and there you go. So you're gonna have 3, they're all 2-pin connectors, a white, a gray, and a black. Now the white one, obviously you can kind of see it's kind of right back here, so you just have to see it and then lift that tab up on it, and you can release it. And once you get to that point, you can take the fender off the bike. Now, to get the factory fender off, so that's a lot like the new SV650 and the GSX-S710, where there's going to be 4 10mm head hex bolts attached to the frame. Now, I think in this case we're using the power driver, but you can use a socket as well. The 2 at the rear are the hardest to get access to, pardon me. These are not going to get reused, but if you are going to keep all your stock parts in the case that you eventually or potentially would want to put it back to stock, then obviously keep these with the factory fender. Now, I would recommend loosening each one before you get to the point where the last one's super tight and kind of bombed up, but get all 4 out. In the case of the 750, it's kind of held on by an interesting little tooth, and you can kind of see, hopefully you can see my finger there. So you kind of push that to the back, or sorry, to the front of the motorcycle, and it will allow the whole fender to come off. Then we can set that down on the bench and break it apart. Once you've got the OEM fender off the motorcycle, we're going to take this back shell piece off, and there's going to be 5 Phillips head screws that are holding that on. I'm going to save 2 of those screws, and you'll see why in a second, but remove those 5 and this will take this whole back panel off. But if you're going to keep your factory hardware and your OEM fender, set all this hardware aside, but we will actually reuse 2 of these guys. And the reason we're going to use 2 is because the OEM license plate light has a huge spacer on it that we're not going to use, and their bolts are really long. So once you get those 5 out, you can remove this top shell. That's going to expose pretty much everything else we need. You can see 2 Phillips head screws that are holding on the license plate light, 2 8mm nuts that are holding on the turn signals, and then realistically the only other thing we have to do is there is a zip tie holding all 3 connections to or the 3 of the wiring looms to this little central boss. And so with a pair of flush cutters or dikes or whatever you may have, you're going to snip that zip tie and take it apart. You're not going to need to worry about reusing that. And start probably by pulling through those 3 harnesses just to get everything kind of ready to go. I would recommend you start with the license plate light. Use your Phillips head screwdriver, either in a driver or just a good old-fashioned screwdriver. Release those 2 bolts. You'll see these guys are really long, and the reason they're really long is because there's this whole extra spacer. And so we're going to take out the light spacer, and along with it is going to come this grommet. And so we are going to reuse that grommet because that keeps everything nice and vibration isolated and weather sealed. But at this point you might as well pull off this long spacer. And since we don't need that spacer, we can't use the factory bolts
for this specific purpose. That's why we're going to use 2 of the shorter ones that actually held that plastic shell on. Super convenient. So set that whole license plate, light, and grommet aside, and we'll finish breaking down the fender. Once you got the license plate light off, all we have to do is take off the turn signal. So take your 8mm, excuse me, box wrench or crescent wrench, and they're not locking nuts, so all you have to do is break them loose once, or quickly by like half a turn, and then you can spin them off by hand. Pull the turn signals out, including the entire wiring harness, and then probably just spin that nut back on so you don't lose track of it. Set that one aside, go to the next one, super fast. Take those turn signals out, left and right, and at this point it's probably useful to mention that the gray is going to be your left signal and the black is going to be your right signal, but that'll be cleared in a little bit when we put it back together. So to start assembling the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator, we're going to start with the license plate. You're going to take your OEM grommet and you're going to install it into this kind of funky shaped cutout. You just put this little drain notch at the bottom. It's going to be on the bottom left, just so if it's facing up it won't actually drain, it'll catch water wherever there may be water. So gonna go around and get the 2 sides of the grommet installed, and it's gonna look a little weird at first, but if you go to the back side you can see you got to pull in those components, and it's going to look a tiny bit crooked, but the light itself is going to help straighten it all out. So get it as good as you can, and then install the light. Now you can tell when you put in that white connector through the center and pull it through, you'll probably expect it to, it should pull the rest of that grommet with it, so that it's not doubled back on itself, which happens when you remove that. Oops, wrong. So get the light seated, make sure you're not pinching the grommet anywhere, and then flip this guy over, and this is where you're going to install your new shorter fasteners. Now there shouldn't be any trouble installing these. They're going to do exactly the same thing, and the thickness of the Fender Eliminator is perfect for this, so that you're actually going to bottom out. And I would always recommend you do that with either a clutched auto driver or power driver, or manually, so you don't over tighten these. But you're going to bottom that guy out. You'll see this is not, it is still grommeted, but it's very firm, so you're not going to see any effects of like a jiggly license plate light, which you get on the OEM bike or the OEM Fender. So at that point we can go ahead and start putting in the turn signals. And like I said, when you're looking at the bottom of the turn signals, they'll be printed, and then that will be a very good indicator of what is the left and right side. But in any case, we've got the gray one, which is going to be the left one. So you can start by feeding the turn signal through, and then spinning on the factory nut. You can get that bottomed out by hand, and then you're going to move to a 8mm box end and finish tightening that. Now you don't want to just tighten this to some obscene torque value, because you're actually pulling, but you'll feel it bottom out. And once you get to that bottom out position, just give it a small tighten. You don't need to worry about kind of trying to pull out this guy through its rubber mount. So moving on to the opposite side, same exact process. The nice thing about this 2-hole arrangement, and we'll double check it here before we install it on the bike, is that that 2-hole should do a pretty good job of getting these guys to be the same clocking position. When I say clocking, I mean like when you're on the bike, the 2 turn signals are pointed the same direction and are more or less horizontal. And you can adjust that a bit by kind of twisting before you can tighten these guys all the way. But the goal of this design is that it kind of matches that curvature, that kind of bend in the side flange should kind of help you line things up. And you can always adjust that once you get on the bike. If you see that one side is tilted differently than the other, or both are tilted the wrong direction, to a certain extent you can just grab them and twist them back into shape. But in this case we're nominally fairly well aligned. Once you get the license plate light and the turn signals on, you just have to feed the connectors through the grommet. Now that grommet is going to go in that large central hole, and you don't actually have to remove the grommet. You can pull everything through right away, and you can take advantage of the fact that the license plate light is going to come with that big boot. That boot is going to help kind of pack that grommet full. But I would try at this point to keep your connections as kind of, don't twist everything up at this point. Try to keep the right turn signal on the right side of the hole and vice versa. And all that's really going to do is help you clean up your install. So kind of push the other connectors to the side, and you can squeeze through without taking the grommet off all 3 2-pin connectors. And at this point, it definitely is worth the minimal extra effort to keep these guys in their respective side, because if you do have a big twisted setup, it's just going to look kind of funky from the other side. So you can tell, got your 2 turn signals, and the center part of the license plate grommet is actually going into the Vagabond grommet. And that's a really nice tight seal, so that these guys aren't going to be able to like jiggle loose or anything like that. Now at this point, we're ready to put the installed or the completed Fender Eliminator onto the motorcycle. And before we take the assembled Fender Eliminator over to the motorcycle, it's important to kind of discuss the hardware mounting approach here. So you're going to get 4 button head screws. Under the head of each button head you're going to put one of the lock washers that we send you. That's going to go through the Fender Eliminator body, and then in between this surface, this top surface of the Fender Eliminator and the motorcycle, we're going to put one of our aluminum spacers. And that's important because if we don't put those spacers on, it's going to kind of crush its way in there, and it's important to kind of keep these spacers in place so it kind of matches with the body lines. Now, if you were to put all 4 of these in position, you would have an extremely hard time because they would kind of jiggle loose and kind of fall out like that. So because we give you long screws, there's absolutely no requirement that you get all 4 in position. I would recommend that you try to get the front 2, and you can do that. You've got 2 hands and lots of fingers, in position first. And if you get those 2 guys screwed in, you can let everything hang back a little bit down and get the top, the kind of the rearward 2 in. And we'll walk through that procedure on the bike, but that's kind of the approach here so that you kind of know what to expect. Now, as you get ready to install this on the bike, we're going to start by taking the completed Fender Eliminator. You'll see I've got 2 fingers holding up to 2 forward bolts. We're going to start by feeding all the 3 electrical connectors through that rearward hole into the subframe of the bike. So that's kind of the first step. You can reach around the top part and start to pull those up, and that's just going to help remove that from some of the things you're going to have to do coming up here. And so get your 4mm T-handle or Allen key ready, and just kind of feed your way forward. And at some point you're going to want to keep removing some slack. See, we've got one loose, and as you can, before you even engage that kind of central tooth, you can actually get, even with your hands without even a wrench, you can get the front 2 bolts started a few threads. Now once you do that, I would always recommend you throw a wrench on there and get them up for real. Oh, that one's actually not in here. There we go. And at that point you can kind of hit the pause button, it can hang down like that, and you can get your hands on the other part of the hardware. Now once you've got the front 2 in, you can kind of take your time with your hands, load in the 3rd and the 4th. And the 4th will be the one you get the least clearance on, but you should still have enough to actually get what you need to get done. And again, just put a couple threads on it and then let it hang. We'll get our 4th. Again, you put the washer under the head of the bolt, start feeding your bolt up, and then with your free hand you want to get the spacer on. Then you're going to feed it up and get a couple threads into that bushing. Now the only part of this that we haven't really discussed is that central kind of plastic tooth coming down, and at some point that's going to want to engage the hole that's in the Fender Eliminator. And once you've got all 4 bolt a couple threads in. Make sure you're keeping your wire harness tight, because that's going to fight you if it's not. And you can kind of pull the whole assembly up, and that little plastic tooth is going to pretty soon start to help you and engage the fender eliminator. Once it's kind of everything's in position, you start incrementally tightening the 4 bolts, and it's going to suck the entire fender eliminator up against those 4 posts, the kind of threaded bosses on the subframe of the bike. Now, because we use those 4 aluminum spacers, we can actually make full metal to metal contact, and that's really important because it keeps things from loosening over time. So the tighter, and we don't want to tighten through plastic, because that's just gonna, the tighter you go, the more you're gonna squeeze it out of the way, and eventually it's gonna crack. But if we're going through, we're essentially going from our aluminum fender eliminator to our aluminum spacers to those steel bosses on the subframe. So it's a very secure connection. So go around and tighten through, or since they're lock washers, you'll feel they get tight, and then you'll feel them bottom out. And once they're tight, give them a little snug up, and you'll feel this thing is rock solid on the subframe of the bike. And once you get the fender eliminator up onto the bike, it's a good time to install your license plate light. And once you get that on, you'll get a kind of good feel for if you need to adjust the angle of these guys. And you're going to want them obviously shining as close to horizontal as possible, so that you're very visible to the drivers behind you. But that'll be your opportunity to make sure they're pointing in the same direction and everything looks really good, because our eyes can be the best judge of if something's crooked or not. At that point, all we have to do is reconnect the wiring harnesses and put your seats back on. Now, to redo the wiring, thankfully, because we took out a long length of your OEM fender, you get a little bit more loom here, which makes connecting to this little white license plate light connector much easier. So I fished this guy out. He was kind of buried back in there when we disconnected it, but now that we've got some length, we can actually make that connection out here. So the only difficult part of this installation on the wiring reconnect is coming back through. Remember, we loosened that connector, you'll see it pop out, that zip tie. So we're going to reattach the whole loop that we took out back here, but there is this one that has just been loosened. And if you totally disconnected that during the install, that's okay. It's pretty easy to make that loop again. The only thing you need to make sure of is that you've captured not just these 3 there you go. Not just these. Try that one again. Occasionally they can get lost into the depths of the subframe and can't find them. Okay, so we got 1, 2. There it is. Okay, so we've got 3 coming through that loop. I wouldn't tighten that looped zip tie yet. What I would do is start making a connection. So this is that kind of troublesome white connector for the license plate light, gray for your turn signals, and black for your turn signals. Now, what I think is probably the easiest thing to do is to kind of pull those cables back from where they were. You could make a loop and tuck it in here. That's okay. I'd prefer to use that zip tie you already have to put back in here and as your service loop. So kind of pull things back a little tight, grab that. You should have, if you just loosened that zip tie, you should be able to grab, without even, you don't know pliers, grab that, you can hear it clicking. So get to the point where I can't really pull looms very much through there, and you're going to be left with a little bit of a service loop. Now, we took this guy off on the very beginning. He just goes around this part of the subframe. That is pardon me. So it has to loop in that brake light harness as well. But what we are going to do is take this time to grab our 3 other connections, our other 3 that we're working with for the Fender Eliminator, and make that loop. So what you're going to have is a little service loop of wiring. And now is the point where you can, now that you've got a loop here, what I like to do is pull this through so that you're left with something that looks really clean. And these kind of green tape markers on the turn signal is actually a very good indicator of where you want to be holding it down. Take advantage of that, loop that whole section up, tighten that a couple, click it through, not super tight because that's going straight to a steel tube. And now you've got your slack, and this slack will go really nicely into the side panel. And so just tuck it in there. You'll have no problem with that through the life of the bike. Tuck that wiring loom back, and at this point the installation for the wiring standpoint is totally complete. Now to just button the bike back together, I've already got the left side done, but you're going to install the seat, which is going to go on first. You're going to take those silver 5mm head kind of shoulder style bolts. Those are going to lock the front of your seat down. Once you've got that tight, you just have to put that plastic panel back, and the step for that is pretty simple. You're going to go ahead and start it with that weird little tooth. There's a slot in your rear plastics. You're going to engage that. You kind of got to move the whole thing towards the side of the bike, and you can kind of eyeball where those 3, you want to make sure you line up this kind of gasket piece. So you should be able to kind of start popping. There we go. There we go. So 3 pops for 3 little plugs and grommets, and then you're securing that panel with that 5mm black bolt. And that is not going to crush the plastic. You can actually tighten it until you bottom it out, give it a nice snug up. So at that point, rider seat's totally on, and you just got to put your passenger seat back on, and that just has a tooth that you lock, pull rearward, push down to hear the click. At that point, you're ready to go. Alright, and with that, the installation of the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator kit for the GSX-S750 is complete. Give you a couple kind of quick walk around views. You'll see should fit really well with the kind of OEM textures and colors. If you kind of go underneath the bike, you can really see how that top plate of the Fender Eliminator matches the cutout in the tail section extremely well. And we spend a lot of time laser scanning every bike we make parts for, so that that's the case, that we get really good fit and finish, and everything looks as factory grade as possible. And so with that, I'd like to say thank you for watching this video. If you have any questions, we can be reached direct at our website, www.vagabondmotorsports. You can also find our products on Amazon for Prime members and eBay. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.